The autumn dust hung thick in the air as another day died over Deadwood Creek, painting the ramshackle buildings in shades of amber and rust. The Gilded Rose Saloon stood like a weathered sentinel at the end of Main Street, its wooden facade scarred by wind and time. The painted sign above the batwing doors faded to barely legible letters. Inside, the familiar symphony of frontier life played out, the clink of whiskey glasses, the shuffle of worn boots on sawdust floors, and the low murmur of men whose pockets were either too heavy or too light for their own good. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the smoke-filled room, their yellow flames struggling against the growing darkness outside. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the sharp bite of corn whiskey that burned going down and left men asking for more. At scattered tables throughout the saloon, various games of chance proceeded with the ritualistic precision of a church service, though the prayers here were whispered to Lady Luck instead of the Almighty. But tonight, all eyes were drawn to the large round table near the back corner, where an unusual poker game was reaching its climax. The pot in the center wasn't just the typical collection of silver dollars, gold pieces, and hastily scrawled IOUs. Chained to a wooden post beside the table, like some grotesque ornament, sat a young woman who had become the evening's most valuable and disturbing prize. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and fell in loose waves past her shoulders. Her dress, once probably a respectable blue calico, was now torn at the sleeves and stained with the evidence of hard travel. But it was her eyes that held the room's attention, pale green like winter ice. They darted between the players with a mixture of fear and desperate calculation. Iron shackles encircled her wrists, connected by a short chain that allowed her limited movement, and similar restraints bound her ankles. The metal had already begun to chafe angry red marks against her fair skin. "Well, gentlemen," wheezed Silas Morton, a heavy-set cattle trader whose luck at cards was legendarily poor, "I reckon this here pot's worth more than most of us see in a year." He mopped his sweating brow with a grimy handkerchief, his nervous energy betraying the strength of his hand, or lack thereof. Across from him sat Diamond Dan McGillicuddy, a traveling gambler whose reputation preceded him from town to town like the stench of a skunk. His waxed mustache twitched as he arranged his cards with practiced precision. The gold tooth that gleamed when he smiled caught the lamplight, giving him the appearance of a well-dressed predator. "Indeed. Morton," McGillicuddy drawled, his Boston accent out of place in this rough frontier establishment. "Though I dare say the young lady represents more than mere monetary value. She's got fire in her, this one. Tried to bite Charlie Red Bear when he brought her in from the trail." The third player, a grizzled buffalo hunter named Tom Rollins, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the brass spittoon beside his chair. "Fire's all well and good, but what's her papers say? We ain't dealing in stolen goods, are we?" McGillicuddy produced a folded document from his vest pocket with a flourish. "All legal and proper, signed by Vernon Kane himself. She owes the Black Vultures a considerable debt, $3,000 to be precise. Her father accumulated quite the gambling problem before his untimely demise, and debts of the blood run deep in these parts." At the mention of the Black Vultures, several men at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably and found sudden interest in their drinks. Everyone in this territory knew of Vernon Kane's organization. They dealt in debts that couldn't be collected through normal means, and their methods of collection were the stuff of whispered warnings around campfires. The young woman, the document had identified her as Claire Donovan, kept her gaze fixed on the scarred wooden table. But Jake Callahan noticed the way her jaw tightened at the mention of her father. He'd been observing the game for the better part of 2 hours, nursing a single whiskey and keeping his thoughts to himself, as was his habit. Jake was new to Deadwood Creek, having drifted in that morning with the dust of a dozen towns on his boots and a look in his dark eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of the world's ugliness. He was a tall man, lean in the way that came from hard living rather than poor eating, with black hair that needed cutting and a several days' growth of beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, a brown leather vest over a white cotton shirt, dark wool pants, and boots that had walked through more mud and blood than most men cared to think about. The Colt 45 on his hip sat with the easy familiarity of a tool rather than an ornament. "Your play, stranger," McGillicuddy called out, having noticed Jake's intense scrutiny. "You've been watching long enough. Time to ante up or move along." Jake stood slowly, his spurs jingling softly against the floorboards as he approached the table. Every eye in the saloon followed him, including Claire's, which lifted for the first time in an hour to study this newcomer. She saw something in his face that made her sit straighter. Not the hungry look of the other men, but something colder and more dangerous. "I'll play," Jake said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time. He pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily with gold coins. "What's the buy-in?" "500 to start," Morton said, his eyes widening at the obvious weight of Jake's purse. "But the stake's been climbing all evening." Jake counted out the coins with methodical precision, stacking them in neat piles before taking the empty chair that had been waiting like a throne. As the cards were dealt, he allowed his gaze to sweep across Claire's face, noting the intelligence behind the fear, the way she held herself despite the chains. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. And in that moment, Jake saw something that reminded him painfully of another young woman, one whose memory had driven him across half the continent in search of justice. The game proceeded with the intensity of a religious ceremony. Cards were dealt, bets were raised, and the tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending occasional puffs of dust through the gaps in the doorframe. The oil lamps flickered, casting writhing shadows on the walls that seemed to dance in rhythm with the rising stakes. Jake played with the steady concentration of a man who understood that luck was just another word for preparation. Meeting opportunity. He won some hands and lost others, but gradually, methodically, he began to accumulate the majority of the chips. McGillicuddy's confident smile had faded to a tight-lipped grimace, while Morton had long since begun to sweat through his shirt despite the cooling evening air. "Last hand, gentlemen," McGillicuddy announced as the clock on the wall chimed 11. "Winner takes all, including the girls' papers." The final deal was made with the solemnity of a funeral rite. Jake studied his cards, a full house, aces over eights, the dead man's hand that had killed Wild Bill Hickok in this very territory. The irony wasn't lost on him as he considered his bet. "I call," he said quietly, "and raise everything I've got." The pile of gold and silver in the center of the table now represented more money than most of these men would see in a lifetime. McGillicuddy's hands trembled slightly as he considered his options, while Morton had already folded with a disgusted grunt. "You're bluffing, stranger," McGillicuddy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Only one way to find out," Jake replied. When the cards were revealed, Jake's full house dominated the table like a conquering army. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind outside and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the darkness beyond the saloon's walls. Jake stood and gathered his winnings, but when McGillicuddy offered him Claire's ownership papers, he paused. Every person in the saloon held their breath, wondering what this mysterious stranger would do with his unusual prize. Claire herself looked up at him with a mixture of resignation and defiance, as if daring him to prove himself no different from the others. Instead of reaching for the papers, Jake turned to face her directly. "What's your name, miss?" The question caught everyone off guard, including Claire herself. Claire Donovan." "Miss Donovan," Jake said formally, as if they were meeting at a church social rather than in a smoke-filled saloon where she'd just been won like a piece of livestock. "Would you like to leave this place?" The simplicity of the question, asked without demands or conditions, seemed to rob her of speech. She stared at him, searching his face for some hidden meaning, some trap she couldn't see. Finally, she found her voice. Yes, but it ain't that simple. These papers—" Jake reached out and took the document from McGillicuddy's outstretched hand. Without ceremony, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the sawdust floor like autumn leaves. "There are no papers," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent saloon. "Miss Donovan is a free woman." The sound that erupted from the room was part gasp, part nervous laughter, and part something else entirely. The sound of men witnessing something they didn't quite understand but knew they'd remember for the rest of their lives. But Claire Donovan didn't look relieved. If anything, she looked more frightened than before. And as Jake moved toward her with the key McGillicuddy had reluctantly provided, she shrank back against the post as if freedom itself was more terrifying than captivity. The key felt heavier in Jake's hand than it should have, its crude iron surface still warm from McGillicuddy's sweating palm. The silence in the Gilded Rose had stretched beyond comfortable into something almost sacred, as if the entire room was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Even the usual sounds of frontier revelry, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of conversation, had died away to nothing. Claire Donovan pressed herself back against the wooden post, her pale green eyes wide with something that looked more like terror than gratitude. The chains that bound her wrists and ankles caught the lamplight, throwing small dancing reflections across her torn dress. Jake could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her hands trembled despite her efforts to appear composed. "Easy now, Miss Donovan," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man might approach a wounded animal, not from fear, but from respect for the damage that fear could cause. "I'm just going to unlock these shackles." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and Claire immediately looked around the room as if expecting punishment for her defiance. When none came, she swallowed hard and tried again. "No. Please. You don't understand. They'll come for me. They'll come for anyone who helps me." Jake paused, the key halfway to the lock on her wrist shackles. "Who will come, Miss Donovan?" But before she could answer, Diamond Dan McGillicuddy's voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "She's talking about the Black Vultures, stranger. And if you had a lick of sense, you'd be worried too." He stood up from the poker table, his gold tooth glinting in the lamplight as he shook his head. "Vernon Kane don't take kindly to folks interfering with his business arrangements. That so?" Jake's voice remained level, but something in his tone made several of the saloon's patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. He didn't turn to look at McGillicuddy, keeping his attention focused on Claire. And what kind of business arrangements would those be? The kind that keep order in this territory. Tom Rollins spoke up from his chair, spitting another stream of tobacco juice toward the spittoon and missing by several inches. "Kane's organization provides certain services, collection of debts, enforcement of contracts, that sort of thing, all legal and proper." Jake finally turned to face the room, and those who looked into his dark eyes saw something that made them wish they'd kept their mouths shut. Legal and proper, he repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. Is that what you call chaining up a young woman and gambling her away like a side of beef? Now see here, McGillicuddy began, but Jake's raised hand silenced him as effectively as a gunshot. I wasn't talking to you. Jake's attention returned to Claire, and his voice gentled again. What's your story, Miss Donovan? What debt could possibly justify this? Claire's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of the men who had been betting on her fate just minutes earlier. Some watched with curiosity, others with the calculating look of predators waiting to see if fresh prey would present itself. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as if each one might tip the balance between life and death. My father, she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the oil lamps. He had debts to Mr. Kane's organization. When he died, they said the debts passed to me. What kind of debts? Jake asked. Gambling debts, mostly, but also... She hesitated, glancing again at the watching faces. He borrowed money for other things, business investments that went bad. The total came to $3,000. A low whistle came from somewhere in the room. $3,000 was more money than most frontier families saw in 5 years. It was the kind of sum that could buy a small ranch, or a man's life, depending on the circumstances. And you agreed to work off this debt? Jake's question was gentle, but Claire flinched as if he'd struck her. I didn't have a choice. They came to our farm 2 weeks after Papa's funeral. Said I could work for them until the debt was paid, or... She trailed off, but everyone in the room could imagine what the alternative might have been. Jake knelt down beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. This close, Claire could see the scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth, and something in his dark eyes that spoke of old pain and carefully controlled anger. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only she could hear him. What's your full name? Miss Donovan? Claire Elizabeth Donovan? And where are you from? Cedar Falls, about 60 miles north of here. My father was... She stopped, seeming to catch herself before revealing something she shouldn't. Your father was what? Claire's green eyes searched his face, as if trying to determine whether she could trust this stranger who had just torn up her ownership papers. A farmer, she said finally. But Jake caught the hesitation in her voice. He nodded as if accepting her answer, though something in his expression suggested he'd heard the lie. Well, Miss Claire Elizabeth Donovan from Cedar Falls. I'm Jake Callahan, and I'm going to unlock these chains now. If you want to run when I do, that's your choice. If you want to stay and talk, that's also your choice. But you're not anyone's property, and you're not going to be as long as I'm around. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent saloon. The shackle around Claire's right wrist fell away, leaving behind an angry red welt that made Jake's jaw tighten with barely suppressed anger. As he moved to unlock the second shackle, Claire spoke again. You don't understand what you're doing. Vernon Kane has men everywhere. They'll hunt you down for this. They'll hunt both of us down. Let them come, Jake said simply, as if discussing the weather. The second shackle fell away, and he moved to work on the chains around her ankles. I've been hunted before. This is different. Kane's not just some local strongman. He's got connections, resources. The Black Vultures have their fingers in every crooked deal from here to Denver. Cross them, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Jake finished with the ankle shackles and stood up, gathering the chains in his hands. The iron links clinked softly as he coiled them up, and for a moment, the sound was the only thing anyone in the saloon could hear. When he looked up at Claire, she was rubbing her wrists where the metal had chafed her skin, staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" It was a good question, and one that Jake wasn't entirely sure he could answer. He could have told her about his sister, about the letter that had arrived 3 years too late, about the trail of vengeance that had brought him to this dusty frontier town. Instead, he simply said, "Because it needed doing." Claire stood up slowly, her legs unsteady after hours of being chained to the post. Jake reached out to steady her, but she flinched away from his touch, and he let his hand drop to his side. The simple gesture spoke volumes about what her recent experiences had been like. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said, and for the first time since Jake had approached her, her voice cracked with genuine emotion. "No money, no family left alive. If Kane's men don't find me, I'll starve on the trail." "You've got choices now," Jake said. "More than you had an hour ago." From across the room, McGillicuddy's voice carried a note of warning. "You're making a mistake. Callahan, Kane won't let this stand. That girl represents a significant investment, and the Black Vultures don't write off investments." Jake turned to face the gambler, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Then Kane and I will have something to discuss when he comes looking." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several of the saloon's patrons began to edge toward the doors, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Others leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that they might be witnessing the beginning of something that would be talked about in these parts for years to come. Claire watched this interplay with growing alarm. "You don't know what you're saying. Kane has 50 men, maybe more. They're not just common criminals, they're organized, disciplined, and they never forget a slight." "Good," Jake said, and there was something in his smile that made Claire take a step back. "I was hoping they'd be the type to hold a grudge." The oil lamps flickered again as a gust of wind rattled the saloon's windows, and outside, the first drops of rain began to spatter against the glass. The autumn storm that had been building all day was finally beginning to break, and with it, the fragile piece of Deadwood Creek seemed about to shatter as well. Jake picked up his winnings from the poker table and stuffed the coins into his leather pouch. Then he turned back to Claire, who was still standing beside the post where she'd been chained, looking lost and uncertain. "There's a boarding house down the street," he said. "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean establishment, and she doesn't ask too many questions. I'll get you a room for the night, and some decent clothes to replace." He gestured at her torn dress. "I can't pay you back," Claire said quietly. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" Jake considered the question for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering lamplight. Finally, he said, "I'm asking you to trust me long enough to get out of this town alive. After that, you can make your own decisions about what comes next." Claire looked around the saloon one more time, taking in the faces of the men who had been prepared to let her be sold like livestock. Then she looked back at Jake Callahan, this stranger who had torn up her ownership papers and offered her freedom without asking for anything in return. "All right," she said. "But when Kane's men come, and they will come, don't say I didn't warn you." Jake's smile was grim but genuine. "Miss Donovan, I'm counting on it." The autumn rain had begun in earnest by the time Jake and Claire stepped through the bat-wing doors of the Gilded Rose Saloon. Fat droplets drummed against the wooden sidewalk and turned the dusty street into a maze of muddy puddles that reflected the yellow glow of the few lit windows still burning in Deadwood Creek. The wind carried with it the scent of wet sage and the promise of an early winter, cutting through their clothes with the kind of cold that settled into a person's bones and stayed there. Claire pulled the torn edges of her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the threadbare fabric offered little protection against the elements. Her shoes, once a respectable pair of brown leather boots, were worn thin at the soles and let in water with each step through the muddy street. Jake noticed her discomfort and shrugged out of his leather vest, offering it to her without a word. "I don't need your pity," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, and she was shivering badly enough that her words came out through chattering teeth. "It's not pity," Jake replied, holding the vest out to her. "It's common sense. You can't run from Kane's men if you freeze to death first." The logic was sound, but Claire hesitated, staring at the offered garment as if it might bite her. Finally, she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, immediately grateful for the warmth that still lingered from Jake's body. The vest smelled of leather and tobacco and something else. Gunpowder, maybe, or the metallic scent that clung to men who had seen violence. They walked in silence toward the boarding house, their footsteps muffled by the mud and the steady patter of rain on the wooden awnings that stretched over the sidewalk. Deadwood Creek had mostly settled in for the night, with only a few hardy souls still moving through the streets. A drunk stumbled out of Murphy's Tavern and nearly collided with them before veering off into an alley, singing something that might have once been a hymn. From somewhere in the distance came the lonely sound of a train whistle, reminding them both that there was a world beyond this small frontier town, a world that suddenly seemed very far away. "The boarding house is just ahead," Jake said, pointing to a 2-story building with a painted sign that read, "Henderson's Rooms, clean beds, fair prices." Light spilled from the windows on the ground floor, and smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and shelter from the storm. But as they approached the front steps, Claire suddenly stopped walking. Her face had gone pale in the moonlight, and her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "I can't," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Can't what?" "I can't go in there, not without—" She looked down at her wrists, where the red marks from the shackles were still clearly visible. "They'll know. Mrs. Henderson will take one look at me and know what I am." Jake followed her gaze and understood. In the lamplight spilling from the boarding house windows, the marks on her wrists looked like brands, marking her as surely as if she'd been tattooed with the words, "Kane's property." "What you were," he corrected gently, "not what you are." But Claire was already backing away from the boarding house, shaking her head. "You don't understand. Word travels fast in a town this size. By morning, everyone will know what happened at the Gilded Rose. They'll know I was chained up like an animal, that I was bet on and won like a hand of cards. No respectable establishment will take me in." There was truth in what she said, and Jake knew it. Frontier towns were small, insular places where everyone knew everyone else's business, and scandal had a way of sticking to a person like tar. A young woman with Claire's recent history would find few doors open to her, and those that did open would likely lead to situations she'd rather avoid. "Then what do you suggest?" Jake asked. Claire looked around the rain-soaked street, her green eyes reflecting the scattered lights from the few buildings that were still occupied. "There's an old cabin about a mile outside town," she said finally. "Abandoned place where prospectors used to hole up during the winter. It's not much, but it's shelter, and no one will think to look for me there." "Us," Jake corrected. "What?" No one will think to look for us there. You think I'm going to set you free just to let you face Kane's men alone?" Claire stared at him, confusion evident on her face. "But why would you?" "I mean, you've already done more than enough. You freed me. You offered to help me get settled. There's no reason for you to put yourself in danger." Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain and thinking about how to answer that question. The truth was complicated, tangled up with memories of another young woman who had needed help and received none. But Claire didn't need to hear about his sister, at least not yet. "Maybe I've got my own reasons for wanting to avoid Kane's men," he said finally. Something in his tone made Claire look at him more carefully, noticing for the first time the way his hand rested naturally on the grip of his Colt, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the careful way he positioned himself so that he could see both ends of the street. These were the habits of a man who had lived with danger for a long time. "What kind of reasons?" she asked. "The kind that are best discussed somewhere warmer and drier than a muddy street." Claire considered this, weighing her options. She could insist on going to the cabin alone, but the truth was that the thought of being by herself in the wilderness, defenseless against whatever Kane might send after her, was terrifying. On the other hand, accepting help from this stranger meant entering into some kind of obligation she didn't understand, and her recent experiences had taught her to be wary of men who offered help without clearly stating what they wanted in return. "All right," she said finally, "but I want to know what I'm getting into. No more mysteries, no more evasions. If we're going to be partners in this, I deserve to know who you really are and what you want." Jake nodded. "Fair enough. But not here." He gestured toward the street, where anyone might be watching from the shadows. Too many eyes and ears in town. They turned away from Henderson's boarding house and began walking toward the edge of Deadwood Creek, where the scattered buildings gave way to open prairie and stands of cottonwood trees. The rain continued to fall, turning the dirt road into a muddy track that sucked at their boots with each step. Claire's thin shoes were soon soaked through, and she had to clench her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering. The cabin Claire had mentioned sat in a grove of trees about a mile from the town's edge, barely visible in the darkness until they were almost upon it. It was a small, single-room structure built from rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a roof that had seen better days. The door hung slightly askew on leather hinges, and several of the chinking between the logs had fallen out, allowing the wind to whistle through the gaps. "Home, sweet home," Claire said with bitter humor as Jake pushed open the door and peered inside. The interior was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a pile of old firewood stacked beside it. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a single bed frame with a straw mattress sat against the far wall. Everything was covered with a layer of dust that spoke of long abandonment, but the roof seemed sound, and the walls would provide protection from the wind and rain. Jake immediately went to work building a fire, using kindling from the woodpile and a handful of dry grass he found in a corner. Soon, flames were crackling in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and filling the room with welcome warmth. Claire stood as close to the fire as she dared, holding her hands out to the flames and sighing with relief as feeling began to return to her fingers. "Better?" Jake asked. "Much." She turned to look at him, and in the firelight, her face was softer than it had been in the harsh glare of the saloon's oil lamps. "Now, about those explanations you owe me." Jake settled into one of the wooden chairs, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, starting with why you really freed me tonight. And don't tell me it was just because it was the right thing to do." Men don't risk their lives for strangers unless they've got skin in the game. Jake stared into the fire for a long moment, watching the flames dance and flicker. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and tinged with old pain. I had a sister once. Her name was Mary. She was about your age, maybe a little younger. Pretty girl, smart as a whip, with dreams of seeing the world beyond our little farm in Kansas. Claire waited, sensing that this story was important, that it might explain everything about this mysterious man who had walked into her life and changed it forever. She fell in with a bad crowd. Jake continued. Specifically, she fell in love with a man who worked for an organization that called itself the Black Vultures. Claire's breath caught. Kane's organization? The same. This was about 3 years ago, before Kane had expanded his operations this far west. My sister thought she was going to marry this man, thought he was going to take her away from farm life and show her the world. Instead, he disappeared one night, and she was never seen again. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the cabin's walls, but inside, the silence stretched between them like a living thing. You think Kane's men took her, Claire said. It wasn't a question. I know they did. I tracked them for 2 years before I found someone willing to talk. Mary had seen too much, knew too much about their operation. They couldn't let her go, but they couldn't trust her to keep quiet either. What happened to her? Jake's jaw tightened, and his hand moved unconsciously to the grip of his pistol. That's what I've been trying to find out for the past year. The trail led me here, to Deadwood Creek, because this is where Kane's been expanding his operation. And tonight, when I saw you chained to that post like a piece of livestock, I saw my sister. I saw what could have happened to her. What probably did happen to her. Claire sank into the other chair, the weight of this revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket. So freeing me wasn't an act of charity. It was revenge. Maybe. Or maybe it was the chance to finally do something right, to save someone when I couldn't save Mary. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire had begun to die down, and Jake added another log, sending fresh sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the storm seemed to be intensifying, with the wind howling through the trees and rain hammering against the cabin's walls. There's something else, Claire said finally. Something I didn't tell you back at the saloon. Jake looked up at her, noting the tension in her voice. My father wasn't just a farmer, she continued. He was a federal marshal, and the reason Kane's men came for me wasn't just because of gambling debts. It was because Papa had been investigating the Black Vultures for over a year before he died. Now it was Jake's turn to stare. Investigating them how? Building a case, gathering evidence. He had files, witness statements, financial records. He was close to bringing down the whole organization when he had his accident. Accident? Claire's laugh was bitter. That's what the local sheriff called it when Papa's horse threw him and he broke his neck. But horses don't spook for no reason. Especially not Ranger. He was the steadiest mount Papa ever owned. Jake felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. And Kane's men think you know where your father hid his evidence. They don't think it, they know it. Because I do. The admission hung between them like a loaded gun. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin's interior for a brief moment before thunder rolled across the prairie. When the sound faded, Jake spoke again. Where is it? Claire met his eyes across the flickering firelight. Hidden in a place where Kane will never think to look. But getting to it means going back to Cedar Falls, which means traveling right through the heart of Black Vulture territory. And you think that if we can get this evidence, we can destroy them, all of them. Kane, his lieutenants, his entire network. Papa spent months building that case, and he was thorough. There's enough evidence hidden in those files to hang half the criminal organizations between here and Denver. Jake leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. What had started as a simple act of defiance in a frontier saloon had suddenly become something much larger. A chance to strike back at the organization that had destroyed both their lives. To get justice for his sister and Claire's father. It won't be easy, he said. Kane will have men watching every road between here and Cedar Falls. The moment we leave this cabin, we'll be hunted. I know, Claire said, but what choice do we have? We can't hide forever, and Kane won't stop looking for me. He can't afford to let me live, knowing what I know. She was right, and they both knew it. The Black Vultures had built their power on fear and the certainty that debts to them were always collected. One way or another, letting Claire escape would be seen as weakness, and weakness was something Vernon Kane could not afford to show. Then we'd better get some rest, Jake said, standing up and checking the locks on the cabin's door and shutters. Because come morning, we're going to have to make some hard decisions about what comes next. As he prepared to bank the fire for the night, Claire spoke again, her voice so quiet he almost missed it over the sound of the storm. Thank you for believing me, for not walking away when you learned how dangerous this was going to be. Jake looked at her. This young woman who had been through so much and still had the courage to fight back against the forces that had destroyed her life. In the dying firelight, he could see echoes of his sister in her face, but also something else, a strength that Mary had never possessed, a determination that suggested Claire Donovan might just be the key to bringing down Vernon Kane and his Black Vultures once and for all. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until we see if we can survive long enough to make Kane pay for what he's done. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, two people who had lost everything to the same enemy began to plan their revenge. Dawn came slowly to the abandoned cabin, seeping through the gaps in the shutters like spilled honey. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with moisture. Jake had slept fitfully in the chair by the dying fire, his hand never straying far from his gun, while Claire had taken the bed after much insistence on his part. She awoke to find him already up, standing at the window and peering through a crack in the shutters at the trail that led back to Deadwood Creek. See anything? She asked, her voice still rough with sleep. Not yet. But they'll come. Kane's not the type to let an insult like last night go unanswered. Claire sat up, running her fingers through her tangled auburn hair. In the morning light, the marks on her wrists seemed even more pronounced, angry red welts that would take weeks to fade completely. She caught Jake looking at them and self-consciously pulled the sleeves of her torn dress down to cover the evidence of her captivity. You said you'd been tracking the Black Vultures for 3 years, she said, changing the subject. What exactly did you learn about them, about Kane? Jake moved away from the window and settled back into his chair, his dark eyes reflecting the pale morning light. More than I wanted to. Less than I needed to. Vernon Kane isn't just some frontier outlaw who got lucky. He's smart, organized, and he's got connections that reach all the way back to Chicago and New York. What kind of connections? The kind that come with badges and political appointments. Kane's got judges in his pocket, sheriffs on his payroll, and enough legitimate businessmen indebted to him that he can operate in the open most of the time. The Black Vultures don't just collect debts and traffic in human cargo. They're a full-scale criminal enterprise with their fingers in everything from cattle rustling to railroad speculation. Claire absorbed this information with growing unease. She had known that Kane was dangerous, but the scope of his operation was larger than she had imagined. How does someone like that get started? From what I could piece together, Kane came west after the war. He'd been a quartermaster in the Union Army, which taught him how to move supplies and manage complex operations. But more importantly, it taught him how to profit from other people's desperation. When the railroad boom started, Kane was already in position to take advantage of the chaos. Jake stood up and began pacing the small cabin, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. He started small, lending money to prospectors and homesteaders at reasonable rates. When they couldn't pay, he'd take their claims or their land, always staying just inside the law. But as his organization grew, so did his ambitions. And that's when he started trafficking people. Among other things, Kane realized that in a territory where women were scarce and men were desperate, there was good money to be made in providing companionship. At first, it was mostly women who had genuine debts to work off. But it didn't take long for the operation to expand into outright kidnapping and forced servitude. The words hung heavy in the morning air, and Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Is that what happened to your sister?" Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mary thought she was in love. The man she met, his name was Thomas Brennan, told her he was a traveling merchant, that he could show her the world beyond our little farm. She believed him because she wanted to believe him. But he was working for Kane. He was one of Kane's recruiters. His job was to find young women in small towns, gain their trust, and then bring them into the organization. Sometimes through promises of marriage, sometimes through manufactured debts, sometimes through outright abduction. Mary was just one of dozens. Claire felt sick. What happened to her? Jake stopped pacing and turned to face her. And in his eyes, she saw a depth of pain and rage that made her stomach clench. That's what I've been trying to find out for 3 years. Brennan disappeared with her one night, and the trail went cold in Kansas City. I tracked them as far as Colorado before I lost the scent completely. But you kept looking. I didn't have a choice. Mary was all the family I had left after our parents died. She was 19 years old, smart and funny and full of dreams about seeing the world. She deserved better than to disappear into Kane's operation like she never existed. Claire stood up and moved to the fireplace, where the ashes from last night's fire still held a hint of warmth. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know that doesn't help. But I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Jake replied, his voice hardening. "Be angry. Because Kane and his people have been destroying lives for years and nobody's been able to stop them. Until now." She turned to look at him, noting the change in his tone. "What do you mean? You said your father had evidence against the Black Vultures. Enough to bring down the whole organization. If that's true, then we have something Kane has never faced before. A real threat to his power." Claire nodded slowly. Papa was very thorough. He didn't just investigate the crimes, he mapped out the entire structure of the organization. Names, locations, financial records, witness testimonies. He even had informants inside Kane's operation. Where? I don't know all of them. Papa kept that information compartmentalized for their protection. But I know he had at least 2 sources close to Kane himself. Jake's eyes sharpened with interest. Close enough to know Kane's plans? His methods of operation? close enough to know that Kane has been planning something big, something that would expand his operation across the entire territory and make him rich enough to buy his way into complete respectability. What kind of something? Claire hesitated, realizing that she was about to share information that could get them both killed if it fell into the wrong hands. But looking at Jake's scarred face and determined eyes, she made her decision. A railroad contract. Kane has been maneuvering to get the exclusive right to provide supplies and labor for the new spur line that's supposed to connect Denver to the northern mining camps. It's worth millions of dollars, and it would give him legitimate cover for moving people and goods across the territory. Jake whistled low. That kind of money would make him untouchable. He could buy enough politicians and lawmen to operate with complete impunity. Exactly. And according to Papa's sources, Kane is planning to eliminate any potential threats to his operation before the contract is finalized. That includes witnesses, informants, and anyone else who might cause problems. The implications of this hung between them like a dark cloud. If Kane was preparing to clean house, then everyone who had ever crossed him or his organization was in immediate danger. Claire's escape from the poker game had probably moved her to the top of that list. How long before the contract is finalized? Jake asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the outside. Papa was trying to get his evidence to the territorial authorities before then, but he died in that convenient accident. Yes, and now Kane thinks the threat died with him. He doesn't know that Papa told me where he hid the evidence. Jake moved back to the window and peered out at the trail again. Still no sign of pursuit, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Kane's men would have started searching at first light, and an abandoned cabin a mile from town would be one of the first places they'd check. "We need to move," he said. "Soon. But first, I need to know exactly where this evidence is hidden and how we're going to get to it." Claire joined him at the window, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. "It's hidden in Cedar Falls, like I said. But not in our old house or anywhere obvious. Papa was smarter than that." "Where then?" "The church, St. Matthew's Lutheran, where Papa served as a deacon for 15 years. There's a hiding place behind the altar that only a few people know about. It was used during the Underground Railroad to hide runaway slaves, and Papa figured it would be the last place anyone would think to look for federal evidence." Jake considered this. A church would provide some measure of sanctuary, and if the hiding place had been used successfully during the Underground Railroad, it was probably well concealed. But getting to Cedar Falls would mean traveling 60 miles through territory that Kane's men would be watching. "What's the route like between here and Cedar Falls?" "There are 2 main roads. The northern route goes through the mining camps and takes about 3 days by horseback. It's well traveled, which means we'd blend in with other riders. But it also means more chances for someone to recognize us. And the southern route, more direct, but it goes through some rough country. Badlands, mostly, with a few trading posts along the way. 2 days of hard riding, but more isolated." Jake weighed the options. The northern route offered the anonymity of crowds, but more opportunities for Kane's men to spot them. The southern route was faster and more isolated, but would leave them exposed if they were discovered. The southern route, he decided. Speed matters more than cover right now. The longer we stay in the territory, the more time Kane has to organize a proper hunt. Claire nodded, though she looked nervous about the prospect of crossing the Badlands. "We'll need supplies, food, water, ammunition, and horses. We can't make that journey on foot." "There's a trading post about 5 miles south of here. Old Pete Morrison runs it, and he's not the type to ask too many questions if the price is right. We can get what we need there." as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of hoofbeats reached their ears from the direction of the main trail. Jake immediately motioned for silence and crept closer to the shuttered window. Through the crack, he could see 3 riders approaching the cabin, moving at a steady pace that suggested they were searching rather than simply traveling. "Kane's men?" Claire whispered. Jake nodded grimly. Even at this distance, he could see that the riders were heavily armed and moving with the systematic thoroughness of professional hunters. They would reach the cabin within minutes. "Back door?" he asked quietly. "There isn't one. Just the front door and the windows." Jake quickly assessed their options. The cabin was surrounded by open ground for about 50 yards in every direction before the tree line began. If they tried to run, they'd be spotted immediately. Their only chance was to hide and hope the searchers would assume the cabin was empty. "Under the bed," he whispered urgently. "Both of us, and don't make a sound no matter what happens." "No." They crawled under the rough wooden bed frame just as the hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin. Jake drew his Colt and held it ready, while Claire pressed herself against the floor and tried to control her breathing. The straw mattress above them smelled of dust and mice, and cobwebs brushed against their faces in the confined space. Heavy boots approached the cabin door, followed by the sound of voices, too muffled to make out words, but clearly discussing their search. The door rattled as someone tested the latch, then creaked open on its leather hinges. "Anybody in here?" a gruff voice called out. Footsteps entered the cabin, moving slowly across the wooden floor. Jake could see boots through the gap between the bed frame and the floor, worn leather with silver spurs that jingled softly with each step. The searcher moved methodically through the small space, checking behind the few pieces of furniture and examining the cold fireplace. "The place has been used recently," another voice said from the doorway. "Ashes are still warm in the fireplace." "Could be drifters," the first voice replied. "Or prospectors heading up to the mines." "Could be. But the boss wants us to check every possibility. That girl's worth a lot of money to him, and the stranger who freed her is going to pay for his interference." The boots moved closer to the bed, and Claire had to bite her lip to keep from crying out when she felt the mattress press down as the searcher sat on the edge. Jake tightened his grip on his pistol, knowing that if they were discovered, their only chance would be to fight their way out. "Find anything?" the second voice called from outside. "Nah. Whoever was here is long gone, probably headed for the northern camps." The pressure on the mattress lifted, and the boots moved away toward the door. "Come on, let's check the next place on the list. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dark." The footsteps receded, followed by the sound of horses being mounted and ridden away. Jake and Claire remained under the bed for several more minutes, listening to the hoofbeats fade into the distance before finally crawling out of their hiding place. "That was too close," Claire said, brushing dust and cobwebs from her hair. Jake holstered his pistol and moved back to the window. "It's going to get closer before this is over. Kane's got them searching in a systematic grid. They'll be back this way eventually. Then we need to leave now." "Agreed, but carefully. Those men will be watching the roads, and they'll have others positioned at key points. We're going to have to be smarter than they are if we want to reach Cedar Falls alive." As they prepared to abandon their temporary sanctuary, both Jake and Claire understood that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Kane's men would never stop hunting them now, and their only hope of survival lay in reaching the evidence that could destroy the Black Vultures before the organization destroyed them. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last traces of the previous night's storm and promising another clear day. But for Jake Callahan and Claire Donovan, the storm was just beginning. The journey to Morrison's trading post took them through terrain that seemed designed to test both horse and rider. Jake had managed to acquire 2 sturdy mounts from a small ranch outside Deadwood Creek, a bay gelding for himself and a smaller chestnut mare for Claire, along with enough supplies to last them several days on the trail. The transaction had cost him most of his poker winnings. But the rancher, a weathered man named Samuel Fletcher, had asked no questions and offered no commentary on the urgency of their departure. They rode in single file along deer paths and cattle trails, avoiding the main roads where Kane's searchers would be most likely to patrol. The autumn sun climbed steadily in a cloudless sky, promising a warm day despite the chill that still lingered in the shadows of the cottonwood groves. Claire had proven to be a competent rider, handling her mare with the easy confidence of someone raised on horseback, though Jake noticed she favored her left side as if nursing an old injury. Morrison's trading post sat in a small valley where 2 streams converged, surrounded by stands of aspen that had turned golden with the season. It was a rambling collection of log buildings connected by covered walkways, with corrals for livestock and a small garden that still showed the remains of summer vegetables. Smoke rose from the main building's chimney, and the sound of hammering suggested that old Pete was working at his forge behind the store. "Looks quiet enough," Jake observed as they approached from the tree line. He had been watching the post for nearly an hour, studying the patterns of movement and looking for any sign that Kane's men had been there before them. "Pete's been running this place for 20 years, Claire said. "Papa used to stop here sometimes when he was traveling on official business. Pete's got no love for Kane or his organization. They've tried to muscle in on his operation more than once." They rode down into the valley at a casual pace, trying to look like ordinary travelers rather than fugitives running for their lives. As they dismounted in front of the main building, a large man emerged from the forge area, wiping his hands on a leather apron. Peter Morrison was built like the blacksmith he had once been, with massive shoulders and arms that spoke of decades working heavy iron. His gray beard was streaked with soot, and his pale blue eyes held the wariness of a man who had learned to be cautious about strangers. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who dealt with all types in his remote location. "What can I do for you folks?" "Need supplies for a few days on the trail," Jake replied. "Food, ammunition, maybe some warmer clothes for the lady." Morrison's eyes flicked over Claire, taking in her torn dress and the fading marks on her wrists that she couldn't quite hide. His expression didn't change, but Jake caught a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition. "Trail supplies I got," Morrison said. "Come on inside and we'll see what you need." The interior of the trading post was a maze of shelves and barrels, filled with everything from coffee and hardtack to saddles and mining equipment. The air smelled of leather and tobacco and the slightly musty scent of goods that had traveled long distances by wagon train. Morrison moved behind the counter and began pulling items from the shelves: dried beef, canned peaches, coffee, and a selection of other trail necessities. "You're Claire Donovan," he said suddenly, not looking up from his work. "Marshall Donovan's daughter." Claire stiffened beside Jake, her hand moving instinctively toward the small derringer she had hidden in her boot. "I don't know what you're talking about." Morrison looked up then, his pale eyes gentle but direct. "Your father was a good man, Miss Donovan. He stopped here many times over the years, and he always spoke of his daughter with great pride. Said you were the smartest person he knew, man or woman." The kindness in his voice seemed to break something inside Claire, and Jake saw her shoulders begin to shake with suppressed emotion. She had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, but Morrison's simple acknowledgement of her father's love was more than she could bear. "He's dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They killed him." "I know," Morrison replied. "No, word travels fast out here, even when folks try to keep things quiet. Your father's death wasn't no accident, and anybody with half a brain knows it." Jake stepped closer to Claire, ready to offer support if she needed it. "What else do you know about Marshall Donovan's death?" Morrison studied Jake with new interest, taking in the careful way he positioned himself near Claire and the professional ease with which he wore his gun. "You'd be the stranger who won her freedom in that poker game last night. Already heard about that, too. News travels fast. In a territory this size, with this few people, everything travels fast, including the fact that Vernon Kane's got half his men out looking for both of you." Morrison leaned forward across the counter, lowering his voice. "What I want to know is what you plan to do about it." Before Jake could answer, Claire spoke up, her voice stronger now despite the tears on her cheeks. "We're going to finish what my father started. We're going to bring down Kane and his whole organization." Morrison nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had been hoping to hear. "Then you'll be needing more than trail supplies. You'll be needing the truth about what your father was really doing in the months before he died." Claire looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean your father wasn't just investigating the Black Vultures as part of his regular duties. He was working with a special federal task force, one that's been trying to build a case against Kane for over 2 years. And he wasn't the only lawman involved." Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "How many others?" "3 that I know of for certain. Maybe more. Marshall Donovan was the coordinator, but he had help from a deputy marshal in Colorado Springs and a federal judge in Denver who's been tracking Kane's financial operations." "Are they still alive?" Claire asked. Morrison's expression darkened. "The deputy marshal, Samuel Harrison, died in a supposed hunting accident 6 weeks ago, shot in the back while tracking elk. They said the judge, Cornelius Whitman, died of food poisoning at a dinner party 3 weeks later." The pattern was clear and chilling. Kane hadn't just eliminated Claire's father. He had systematically murdered everyone involved in the federal investigation, which meant that Claire and the evidence she could lead them to were now the only remaining threats to his operation. "That's why you're so important to Kane," Jake said to Claire. "You're not just a witness or someone who owes him money. You're the last person alive who knows where the evidence is hidden." Claire nodded, understanding flooding her features. "Papa made me memorize everything, not just the location of the evidence, but the names of contacts, the structure of the investigation, everything. He said if anything happened to him, I would be the only one who could finish his work." Morrison reached under the counter and pulled out a canvas bag, which he began filling with the supplies he had gathered. "Your father came here 3 days before he died, left something for safekeeping, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you." He disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Claire recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her mother, and her father had kept his most precious possessions in it after her death. With trembling fingers, Claire opened the box. Inside were several folded documents, a small key, and a photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like Claire herself, but it was the letter on top, written in her father's familiar handwriting, that made her gasp. "My dearest Claire," she read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, but do not despair, for you have everything you need to finish what we started. The evidence is hidden where we discussed, but there is more, much more than even you know." She paused, looking up at Jake and Morrison. "Should I continue?" "Read it all," Jake said gently. We need to know everything. Claire took a deep breath and continued reading. The key in this box opens a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Denver, under the name Margaret Donovan, your mother's name. Inside that box, you will find additional evidence that connects Kane's operation to corrupt officials in Washington. This evidence came from a source very close to Kane himself, someone who has been feeding us information for months. Jake leaned forward intently. A spy inside Kane's organization? Claire continued reading. The source's identity must be protected at all costs. But if you reach Denver safely, ask for Thomas Brennan at the hotel. She stopped abruptly, the blood draining from her face. Thomas Brennan. That's the name you said, isn't it? The man who took your sister? Jake's face had gone very still, and his hand moved unconsciously to his gun. Read the rest. Thomas Brennan at the hotel will know how to contact our source. Trust him, Claire, even though his past actions may seem unforgivable. He has been working to bring down Kane from the inside, and his information has been crucial to our investigation. Without his help, we never could have built such a comprehensive case. The letter fell from Claire's nerveless fingers as the implications hit both her and Jake like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan, the man Jake had been hunting for 3 years, the man he blamed for his sister's disappearance, was working as a federal informant. It can't be, Jake said, his voice hoarse with shock and rage. He took Mary. I saw them leave together. She trusted him, and he betrayed that trust. Morrison picked up the letter and continued reading where Claire had left off. I know this will be difficult to understand, but Brennan's recruitment of young women was done with federal approval as a way to infiltrate Kane's operation. The women were never in real danger. They were relocated with new identities and federal protection. Mary Callahan is alive and well, living under the name Sarah Thompson in a small town in Oregon. Brennan has been providing us with detailed information about Kane's trafficking operation. Information that will save dozens of lives when we finally move against him. Jake sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. His sister was alive. The man he had been hunting was actually trying to help the women he appeared to be victimizing. Everything Jake had believed about the past 3 years was wrong. Claire knelt beside his chair, her own shock giving way to sympathy for his emotional turmoil. Jake, this is good news. Your sister is alive. But I've spent 3 years hating him, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years planning to kill him for something he was doing to help people. Morrison folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Claire. Your father was a smart man, Miss Donovan. He knew that sometimes the best way to fight an enemy is from the inside. Brennan sacrificed his own reputation and peace of mind to get close enough to Kane to gather the evidence needed to bring him down. Claire stood up, her resolve strengthening as she processed this new information. Then we have more allies than we thought. If Brennan is still alive and still feeding information to the federal authorities, he might be able to help us get to the evidence safely. Assuming Kane hasn't discovered his true loyalties, Jake said, finally looking up from his contemplation. And assuming we can find him before Kane's men find us. Morrison added a few more items to their supply bag, including extra ammunition and a warm coat for Claire. There's something else you should know. Kane's planning something big for next week. I don't know the details, but I've seen supply wagons heading toward his main compound, and word is he's called in men from all his satellite operations. The railroad contract, Claire said. He's probably planning to eliminate all remaining threats before the deal is finalized. Which means we're running out of time, Jake added, standing up and checking his weapons. How far to Denver from here? 3 days hard riding if you take the southern route through the Badlands, Morrison replied. "But that's rough country, and Kane's got patrols there too." Claire tucked her father's letter and the key into her bodice, the safest place she could think of to carry such crucial items. "We don't have a choice. We have to try." As they prepared to leave Morrison's trading post, each of them understood that they were embarking on a journey that would either destroy Vernon Kane's criminal empire or get them all killed in the attempt. The revelation about Thomas Brennan had changed everything, adding new dimensions to their mission and new possibilities for success. But it had also made their situation more dangerous. If Kane discovered that one of his most trusted men was actually a federal informant, he would stop at nothing to eliminate everyone connected to the investigation. The hunt for Jake and Claire would intensify, and their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride south toward the Badlands, Claire looked back at Morrison, who stood watching them from his doorway. "Thank you," she called out, "for everything." The old trader nodded gravely. "Finish what your father started, Miss Donovan. There are a lot of good people counting on you." With that sobering thought weighing on their minds, Jake and Claire spurred their horses toward the uncertain safety of the Southern Trail, carrying with them the hope that they could reach Denver and the evidence that might finally bring justice to the frontier. The decision came to them as they camped in a narrow canyon 20 miles south of Morrison's trading post, with the autumn stars wheeling overhead and the distant howl of coyotes echoing off the rock walls. They had been discussing their options around a carefully concealed fire, weighing the dangers of continuing toward Denver against the growing certainty that Kane's men would eventually track them down no matter where they ran. "We can't keep running forever," Claire said, poking at the dying embers with a stick. "Kane has too many resources, too many men. Even if we make it to Denver, even if we get the evidence from the bank, what's to stop him from having us killed before we can turn it over to the authorities?" Jake stared up at the star-filled sky, thinking about the letter from Claire's father and the revelation about Thomas Brennan. Everything he had believed about the past 3 years had been turned upside down, and he was still struggling to process the implications. His sister was alive. The man he had hunted was actually an ally, and the enemy he faced was larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "There might be another way," he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Your father's letter mentioned that Brennan is still working undercover, still gathering information from inside Kane's organization. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that instead of running to Denver, we go straight to the source. We find Kane's main compound, we make contact with Brennan, and we use his position inside the organization to get close enough to Kane to end this once and for all." Claire stared at him across the fire, her green eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "That's insane. You're talking about walking straight into the heart of Kane's operation. Even with Brennan's help, the odds of success would be minimal." "The odds of success are minimal no matter what we do. But this way, we take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to find us. And if we can coordinate with Brennan, we might be able to gather enough evidence to not only destroy Kane, but to expose the entire network of corruption that's protecting him." The plan was dangerous to the point of seeming suicidal, but as Claire considered it, she began to see the twisted logic. Kane would never expect them to voluntarily enter his stronghold, and if they could maintain the pretense that Claire was being returned as a captured fugitive, they might be able to get close enough to Kane to strike a decisive blow. "How would we even find his main compound?" she asked. "And how would we contact Brennan without exposing him?" Jake pulled out a piece of paper from his saddlebags, a rough map he had been working on for months, marking locations where Kane's men had been spotted and trying to determine the center of their operations. I've been tracking patterns of movement for over a year. Supply wagons, messenger routes, the comings and goings of Kane's lieutenants. The compound has to be somewhere in this area, he said, pointing to a circle on the map about 40 miles northeast of their current position. That's rough country, broken mesas and hidden valleys, perfect place to hide a large operation. Exactly. And as for contacting Brennan, Jake hesitated, knowing that what he was about to propose would be the most dangerous part of the entire plan. We let ourselves be captured. Claire's breath caught. What? Think about it. Kane's men are searching for us all over the territory. What if they found us? What if they brought us in as prisoners? I could play the role of a bounty hunter who captured you for the reward, and you could pretend to be a terrified captive who's willing to cooperate in exchange for better treatment. And once we're inside, we find a way to signal Brennan. Your father's letter said he would know how to contact their source. If Brennan is as highly placed in Kane's organization as the letter suggests, he'll be involved in our interrogation. That's when we reveal who we really are and what we're trying to accomplish. Claire stood up and began pacing around the fire, her mind racing through the implications of such a plan. It could work, she said finally. But it would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. If Kane suspects anything, if Brennan's cover has been blown, if any one of a dozen things goes wrong, we'll be dead, Jake finished. But we're probably dead anyway if we keep running. At least this way, we have a chance to accomplish something meaningful before the end. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting their faces in a warm red light that made the surrounding darkness seem even more profound. In the distance, an owl called from somewhere high up on the canyon walls, its voice lonely and haunting in the night air. There's something else, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something I haven't told you about the evidence my father gathered. Jake looked up at her, noting the tension in her posture. What? The documents hidden in Cedar Falls aren't just evidence of Kane's crimes. They're also evidence of a conspiracy that reaches much higher than anyone suspected. Papa discovered that Kane has been working with government officials in Washington to secure that railroad contract through bribery and intimidation. How high does it go? High enough that turning the evidence over to local authorities might not be sufficient. Papa believed that some of the territorial judges and federal marshals were compromised. That's why he was working with the Special Task Force. They were the only people he could trust. Jake absorbed this information with growing unease. If Kane's corruption reached into the highest levels of territorial government, then even successfully gathering the evidence might not be enough to bring him down. They would need to be very careful about who they trusted and how they handled any information they gathered. All the more reason to try this approach, he said finally. If we can get inside Kane's operation and coordinate with Brennan, we might be able to gather enough new evidence to build an unshakable case. Something so comprehensive that even corrupt officials can't ignore it. Claire sat back down beside the fire, her decision made. All right, but we do this my way. I know Kane's methods, and I know how he thinks. If we're going to convince him that I'm a genuine captive, I'll need to look the part. Jake understood what she was suggesting, and his jaw tightened with distaste. Claire, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Kane will be suspicious if I look too well treated. He'll expect to see evidence that I've been handled roughly. Bruises, torn clothing, signs of fear and desperation. The thought of deliberately harming Claire, even in the service of their plan, made Jake's stomach turn. But he also understood the logic. Kane was a predator who understood the language of violence and intimidation. If they wanted to fool him, They would have to speak that language convincingly. There has to be another way. There isn't, and you know it. We have one chance to get this right, and we can't let squeamishness ruin it. Claire's voice was steady, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She was terrified of what they were planning, but she was also determined to see it through. They spent the rest of the night working out the details of their deception. Jake would approach Kane's compound in the guise of a bounty hunter who had captured Claire after tracking her across the territory. He would claim to have overheard conversations in various saloons about Kane's search for the escaped woman and decided to collect the reward for himself. To make the story convincing, they would need to stage evidence of a struggle, complete with torn clothing and convincing but superficial injuries. As dawn approached, they began the grim work of preparing for their masquerade. Claire tore her dress in strategic places and rubbed dirt into the fabric to make it look as though she had been dragged through rough country. Jake helped her apply carefully controlled bruises using techniques he had learned from a stage actor in Denver. Pressure applied to specific points that would create discoloration without causing real harm. The hardest part was the emotional preparation. Claire would need to convince Kane's men that she was a broken, terrified captive who had given up hope of escape. She would have to suppress her natural intelligence and courage, playing the role of a victim so convincingly that even experienced criminals would believe it. "Remember," Jake said as they prepared to break camp, "once we're inside, you can't give any sign that you know me or that we're working together. As far as anyone knows, I'm just a bounty hunter who got lucky, and you're a prisoner who would do anything to escape. What about the signal to Brennan? How will we let him know who we really are?" Jake had thought about this extensively during the night. "Your father's letter mentioned that Brennan would know how to contact their source. If I can work the phrase Margaret Donovan into conversation, your mother's name from the bank box, it should be enough to tip him off that we're connected to the federal investigation." Claire nodded, committing the detail to memory. "And if Brennan isn't there, if something has happened to him, then we improvise. But we stick to the plan as long as possible. The key is to gather as much information as we can while we're inside, even if we can't make contact with our ally." As the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, they mounted their horses and began riding northeast toward the area where Jake believed Kane's compound was located. The landscape gradually changed from the relatively gentle hills around Morrison's trading post to the broken, rugged terrain of the Badlands, a maze of mesas, canyons, and hidden valleys that had served as hideouts for outlaws and renegades for decades. They rode in character now, with Jake leading and Claire following several paces behind with her hands bound and a rope around her waist that connected her to Jake's saddle horn. To any observer, it would look like exactly what they wanted it to look like: a bounty hunter bringing in a captured fugitive. The acting required constant vigilance. Claire had to maintain the posture and expression of a defeated captive while remaining alert for signs of Kane's men. Jake had to project the confidence of a successful hunter while watching for any indication that their deception had been discovered. As they climbed into the higher elevations, the air grew thinner and colder, and the landscape became increasingly desolate. This was country where a person could disappear forever, where the bones of the lost could lie undiscovered for decades. It was perfect territory for someone like Vernon Kane to build his criminal empire, far from the prying eyes of law enforcement and close enough to major trade routes to facilitate his various illegal activities. "There," Jake said quietly as they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley. "That has to be it." Below them, nestled against the base of a red sandstone cliff, was a collection of buildings that looked like a cross between a ranch and a fort. There were barrack-style structures for housing men, corrals for horses, supply warehouses, and at the center of it all, a large main house that was clearly designed to serve as both residence and command center. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could see men moving about the compound with the purposeful activity of a well-organized operation. "How many men do you think?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. 50, maybe more. Enough to hold off a small army if they had to. As they watched, a group of riders left the compound and headed in their direction, moving with the systematic pattern of a patrol. Jake and Claire quickly took their positions, he assuming the confident posture of a successful bounty hunter. She slumping in her saddle with the defeated expression of a captured fugitive. Their masquerade was about to begin, and with it, their most dangerous gamble yet. In the next few hours, they would either succeed in infiltrating Kane's organization or they would die trying. There would be no middle ground, no second chances, and no room for error. As the patrol approached, Jake checked his weapons one last time and Claire lowered her eyes in the manner of a thoroughly broken captive. The moment of truth had arrived. The patrol consisted of 4 riders, hard men with the weathered faces and suspicious eyes of professional gunfighters. Their leader, a lean man with a graying beard and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, approached with his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. His pale blue eyes took in every detail of Jake and Claire's appearance, noting the rope that bound her, the defeated slump of her shoulders, and the confident bearing of the man who claimed to have captured her. "Hold up there, stranger," the leader called out when they were still 20 yards away. "State your business in these parts." Jake reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat with practiced casualness. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, using the trading post owner's surname as part of his cover story. "I'm a bounty hunter out of Colorado Springs, and I've got something here that belongs to Vernon Kane." The patrol leader's eyes sharpened with interest. "Is that so? And what might that be?" Jake gestured toward Claire, who kept her head down and maintained the posture of a thoroughly broken captive. "Claire Donovan. Word in the saloons is that Kane's offering good money for her return. $500, one of the other patrol members said. Dead or alive?" "Well, she's alive," Jake replied. "Though she gave me quite a chase. Had to track her all the way down to the Mexican border before I caught up with her. Girl's got more fight in her than you'd expect." The patrol leader dismounted and approached Claire's horse, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man who had seen many prisoners over the years. Claire forced herself to remain perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. The smell of tobacco and unwashed bodies surrounded her as the man reached up to lift her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're Claire Donovan?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice carefully modulated to convey fear and resignation. "Please, I just want to go home. I don't know anything about Mr. Kane's business." The man laughed, a harsh sound that held no warmth. "That's what they all say. But Kane will want to have a conversation with you about some papers that went missing when your daddy died." Jake leaned forward in his saddle, projecting the eager interest of a bounty hunter smelling a larger payday. "Papers? Nobody mentioned anything about papers. If there's more to this than just bringing her in, maybe we should discuss a bonus for my trouble." "That's between you and Kane," the patrol leader said, remounting his horse. "Follow us, and keep that rope tight. This one's slippery as a greased pig when she wants to be." The ride down into the compound gave Jake and Claire their first close look at the scope of Kane's operation. What had appeared from the ridge to be a simple ranch was actually a sophisticated criminal enterprise. They passed guard posts positioned at strategic points along the trail, each manned by armed sentries who watched their approach with professional alertness. The buildings were constructed of local stone and timber, designed to blend into the landscape while providing defensible positions in case of attack. As they entered the main compound, Jake counted at least 30 men visible in various areas, some tending horses in the corrals, others loading supplies into wagons, still others practicing with weapons in a cleared area behind the barracks. These weren't just common outlaws, they moved with the discipline and organization of a military unit. The main house dominated the center of the compound, a two-story structure built in the Spanish colonial style with thick walls and small windows that would be difficult to breach in an assault. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the sound of voices from within suggested that important business was being conducted. "Kane's expecting us?" Jake asked as they dismounted in front of the main house. "Kane's always expecting visitors," the patrol leader replied with a grim smile. "The question is whether they leave the same way they came in." Two guards flanked the heavy wooden door of the main house, both armed with rifles and wearing the hard expressions of men who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. They nodded to the patrol leader as he approached, indicating that he was a familiar and trusted figure in Kane's organization. "Tell the boss we've got the Donovan girl," the patrol leader said to one of the guards, "and the bounty hunter who brought her in wants to discuss payment." The guard disappeared inside while Jake and Claire waited in the compound's central courtyard. Claire continued to play her role perfectly, keeping her eyes downcast and maintaining the trembling posture of a terrified captive. But Jake could see the intelligence behind her performance, the way she was cataloging details about the compound's layout and defenses for future reference. After several minutes, the guard returned and motioned for them to enter. "Kane will see you now, but only the hunter goes in armed. The girl gets searched first." This was a moment they had anticipated and prepared for. Claire was hiding nothing more dangerous than the small derringer in her boot, which she had positioned so that a casual search would miss it, but a thorough one would find it. The discovery of a concealed weapon would actually strengthen their cover story, making her seem like a desperate fugitive rather than a willing participant in an elaborate deception. The search was conducted by a hard-faced woman who emerged from a side room, her movements efficient and professional. She found the derringer within seconds and held it up with a knowing smile. "Well, well, our little dove still has some claws." "Take it," Claire said with convincing bitterness. "Won't do me any good where I'm going." The woman pocketed the small pistol and gestured toward the main room. "Kane's waiting." The interior of the house reflected Vernon Kane's success and his pretensions to respectability. The walls were lined with expensive furniture and artwork that had clearly been transported from back east at considerable expense. Persian rugs covered polished wooden floors, and oil paintings in ornate frames depicted scenes of English countryside that seemed absurdly out of place in this frontier stronghold. Vernon Kane himself stood behind a massive oak desk that dominated one end of the room, and Jake's first impression was of a man who had successfully transformed himself from frontier criminal to respectable businessman. Kane was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair and a carefully groomed beard. He wore a well-tailored suit that looked like it had come from Chicago or New York, and his manner radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to absolute authority. But it was Kane's eyes that revealed his true nature. Pale gray orbs that held all the warmth and mercy of a winter storm. These were the eyes of a predator who had learned to dress like a gentleman but had never forgotten how to kill. "Miss Donovan," Kane said, his voice cultured and precise. "How good of you to finally join us. I trust your journey wasn't too uncomfortable." Claire raised her eyes just enough to meet his gaze before quickly looking away, as a truly frightened captive would do. "Please, Mr. Kane, I don't know what you want from me. I'm just a farmer's daughter." Kane's smile was thin and cold. Oh, my dear, we both know that's not entirely accurate. Your father was many things, but a simple farmer was not among them. He was a federal marshal who spent the last months of his life trying to build a case against my organization. The admission was delivered with such casual confidence that it sent chills down Claire's spine. Kane wasn't just acknowledging her father's investigation. He was practically bragging about having defeated it. I don't know anything about that, Claire said, maintaining her performance despite her growing fear. Papa never talked about his work at home. Perhaps not, but he did leave certain materials that belong to me, materials that I'm very interested in recovering. Jake stepped forward slightly, projecting the impatience of a bounty hunter who wanted to collect his fee and leave. Excuse me, Mr. Kane, but we had an agreement. $500 for bringing her in alive. I've fulfilled my part of the bargain. Kane's attention shifted to Jake, and those cold gray eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity. Indeed we did, Mr. Morrison. Though I'm curious about how you managed to track Miss Donovan when my own men, who know this territory intimately, were unable to locate her. The question carried an undertone of suspicion that made Jake's hand itch to reach for his gun. But he maintained his cover, projecting the confidence of a professional tracker. I've been hunting men for 15 years, Mr. Kane. I know how to read sign, and I know how people think when they're running scared. She made a beeline for the Mexican border, just like most fugitives do. Interesting. And did she give you any trouble during the capture? More than I expected. Had to get rough with her to make her see reason. Jake gestured toward the carefully applied bruises on Claire's face. But nothing permanent. I know the value of delivering merchandise in good condition. The casual way Jake referred to Claire as merchandise made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to maintain her defeated posture. This was exactly the kind of language Kane would expect from a bounty hunter, and Jake was playing the role perfectly. Kane moved around his desk and approached Claire, studying her with the same calculating gaze the patrol leader had used earlier. Tell me, my dear, did Mr. Morrison here treat you appropriately during your journey? The question was loaded with implications, and Claire understood that Kane was probing for any sign that she and Jake were more than captor and captive. He kept his hands to himself. If that's what you're asking, she said with convincing resentment. Just interested in collecting his money. Good. I prefer my acquisitions to be undamaged. Kane returned to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. Your payment, Mr. Morrison, $500, as agreed. Jake stepped forward to accept the payment, but Kane held up a hand to stop him. However, I'm afraid I have a proposition that might interest you. You see, Miss Donovan's capture was only the beginning of our business together. I believe she possesses information that could be very valuable to my organization, and I'm prepared to pay handsomely for your assistance in extracting that information. What kind of assistance? Jake asked, though he suspected he knew where this was heading. The kind that requires a man with your particular skills. You see, Miss Donovan has been somewhat uncooperative regarding the location of certain documents that belong to her father. Perhaps a more persuasive approach is needed. Claire felt her blood turn to ice. Kane was essentially asking Jake to torture her for information, and if Jake refused, it would blow their cover. But if he agreed, there was no telling how far Kane would expect him to go. Before Jake could respond, footsteps approached from a side corridor, and a new voice entered the conversation. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Kane, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention. Jake turned to see a man in his 30s approaching the desk, tall, lean, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. He was dressed like a gentleman but moved with the controlled grace of someone comfortable with violence. "Mr. Morrison," Kane said, "allow me to introduce Thomas Brennan, my chief of operations. Thomas, this is the bounty hunter who finally brought us Miss Donovan." Jake's blood roared in his ears. This was the man he had hunted for 3 years, the man he had blamed for his sister's disappearance. Every instinct screamed at him to draw his gun and settle their account right here and now. But Claire's father's letter had changed everything, and Jake forced himself to remain calm. Brennan approached with an extended hand, and Jake found himself shaking hands with the man he had once sworn to kill. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I've heard good things about your tracking abilities." "Just doing my job," Jake replied, studying Brennan's face for any sign of recognition or deception. "Indeed. And speaking of jobs, Mr. Kane, we have a situation developing in the northern camps that requires immediate attention. 3 of our collection teams have failed to report in, and there are rumors of federal marshals asking questions in Denver." Kane's expression darkened. "How reliable are these rumors?" "Reliable enough that I think we should accelerate our timeline. The railroad contract signing is scheduled for next week, and we can't afford any complications before then." Jake and Claire exchanged the briefest of glances, but it was enough to confirm that they were both thinking the same thing. If Kane was accelerating his timeline, then their window of opportunity was closing even faster than they had anticipated. "Very well," Kane said. "But first, we need to resolve the matter of Miss Donovan's cooperation. Mr. Morrison, I'm prepared to offer you an additional $500 to assist Mr. Brennan in convincing our guest to be more forthcoming about her father's papers." The moment had arrived. Jake had to make a choice that would determine not only the success of their mission but possibly their survival. He looked at Claire, saw the fear in her eyes that wasn't entirely an act, and made his decision. "I'm interested," he said. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Kane's smile was the coldest thing Jake had ever seen. "Oh, I think you'll find our methods quite persuasive. Mr. Brennan will show you to our special interrogation room. I'm sure Miss Donovan will be much more cooperative once she understands the full extent of her situation." As guards moved to escort Claire away and Brennan gestured for Jake to follow, both of them understood that they were walking deeper into the heart of Kane's operation than they had ever intended. Their masquerade had succeeded beyond their expectations, but it had also trapped them in a situation from which escape might prove impossible. The real test of their plan was about to begin. The interrogation room was located in the basement of Kane's main house, a windowless stone chamber that had clearly been designed for the extraction of information through unpleasant means. Heavy wooden beams supported the ceiling, and iron rings set into the walls spoke of the room's grim purpose. A single oil lamp provided flickering illumination, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. Claire was secured to a sturdy wooden chair in the center of the room, her hands bound behind her back with rope that bit into her wrists. 2 guards flanked the door, their faces impassive as they waited for orders. Thomas Brennan stood near a table laden with various implements that Jake preferred not to examine too closely, while Kane himself had descended from his office to personally oversee the proceedings. "Now then, Miss Donovan," Kane said, his cultured voice echoing off the stone walls. "I believe it's time we had a frank discussion about your father's legacy. Specifically, the location of certain documents that rightfully belong to me." Claire kept her eyes downcast, maintaining her performance as a terrified captive even as her mind raced through possibilities for escape. The room had only one entrance, which was blocked by armed guards. The stone walls were too thick to break through, and the ceiling was too high to reach. Their only hope lay in the plan they had discussed, somehow making contact with Brennan and revealing their true purpose. "I already told you," Claire said, her voice trembling with convincing fear. "I don't know anything about Papa's work. He never brought his business home." Kane's smile was thin and predatory. "Oh, my dear child, we both know that's not true. Your father was building a case against my organization for months before his unfortunate accident. He had to have confided in someone, and who better than his beloved daughter?" Jake stood near the wall, playing the role of a disinterested bounty hunter waiting to collect his bonus payment. But his eyes were constantly moving, cataloging details about the room's layout and looking for anything that might give them an advantage when the time came to act. "Perhaps a demonstration would help clarify the situation," Kane continued, nodding to Brennan. "Thomas, would you be so kind as to show Miss Donovan one of our persuasive techniques?" This was the moment Jake had been dreading. If Brennan was truly working undercover for the federal authorities, he would have to find a way to avoid actually harming Claire while maintaining his cover. But if something had gone wrong, if his true loyalties had been discovered, or if he had genuinely turned criminal, then Claire was about to suffer for their miscalculation. Brennan approached the table and selected a thin-bladed knife, its edge gleaming in the lamplight. As he turned toward Claire, Jake caught a glimpse of his eyes and saw something there that gave him hope. A flicker of recognition and purpose that suggested the man was still playing his assigned role. "This really isn't necessary," Brennan said, addressing Kane while moving closer to Claire. "Sometimes the threat of pain is more effective than pain itself. Isn't that right, Miss Donovan?" As he spoke, Brennan's hand brushed against Claire's shoulder and she felt him slip something small and hard into the folds of her dress. Her heart leaped as she realized what it was. A key. Probably for the ropes that bound her hands. "Fear can be a powerful motivator," Kane agreed. "But sometimes more direct persuasion is required. Proceed, Thomas." Brennan raised the knife, but instead of moving toward Claire, he stepped closer to Jake. "Before we begin, Mr. and Morrison, I'm curious about something. You mentioned tracking Miss Donovan to the Mexican border, but my sources tell me she was seen much closer to home, near Cedar Falls. In fact," Jake's pulse quickened, "this could be Brennan testing their cover story, or it could be a genuine challenge to their deception. Either way, he had to respond carefully. "Sources can be wrong," Jake said with a shrug. "I know where I found her, and it wasn't anywhere near Cedar Falls. Perhaps, but there's something else that bothers me." Brennan's voice had taken on a harder edge, and Jake could see Kane watching the exchange with growing interest. "You see, I've been thinking about your name, Morrison. There's a trading post owner named Pete Morrison who's been known to help people who oppose Mr. Kane's organization." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Jake realized that their cover story was unraveling, and he had only seconds to decide whether to maintain the deception or take decisive action. His hand moved imperceptibly closer to his gun. "Never heard of him," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Really? Because I'm beginning to think you're not who you claim to be, Mr. Morrison. In fact, I'm beginning to think you might be someone else entirely. Someone with a very personal interest in seeing Mr. Kane's operation destroyed." Kane's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. "Thomas, what are you suggesting?" But instead of answering Kane's question, Brennan did something that shocked everyone in the room. He spun around and drove the knife into the shoulder of the guard nearest to the door, sending the man stumbling backward with a cry of pain and surprise. "I'm suggesting," Brennan said as he drew his pistol and pointed it at Kane, "that Mr. Morrison here isn't a bounty hunter at all. He's Jake Callahan, brother of Mary Callahan, and he's been hunting the Black Vultures for 3 years." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Kane's face went white with rage and fear, while the remaining guard fumbled for his weapon. Jake drew his Colt with lightning speed, putting a bullet through the second guard's gun hand before the man could clear leather. "And Miss Donovan," Brennan continued, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them, "isn't just some farmer's daughter. She's the key to destroying your entire operation, Kane. She knows where her father hid evidence that will bring down not just you, but every corrupt official who's been protecting you." Claire had managed to work the key Brennan had given her into the lock on her ropes, and her hands came free just as Kane reached for a gun hidden in his jacket. She threw herself sideways out of the chair, rolling behind an overturned table as Kane's bullet splintered the wood where she had been sitting. "You're a dead man, Brennan," Kane snarled as he dove for cover behind a stone pillar. "I trusted you. I brought you into my inner circle. And I've been feeding information to the federal authorities for 2 years, Brennan replied, advancing toward Kane's position with his gun trained on the pillar. "Every shipment, every operation, every dirty deal you've made, it's all been documented and passed along to people who know how to use it." Jake moved to flank Kane from the other side, stepping over the wounded guards who were clutching their injuries and trying to stay out of the line of fire. The oil lamp had been knocked over in the initial struggle, and shadows danced wildly across the stone walls as the spilled oil caught fire. "You can't escape," Kane said, his voice echoing from behind the pillar. "This compound is filled with my men. Even if you kill me, you'll never make it out alive." "Maybe not," Jake replied. "But we'll make sure the truth about your operation gets out. The evidence is already in safe hands. Kane, your reign of terror is over." Kane's response was to lean around the pillar and fire 3 quick shots, one of which caught Brennan in the leg and sent him stumbling against the wall. Claire saw her chance and snatched up the wounded guard's fallen pistol, adding her firepower to the desperate battle. The fire from the spilled oil was spreading across the wooden floor, filling the basement room with smoke and the acrid smell of burning. The heat was becoming intense, and Jake realized they had only minutes before the entire room became an inferno. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the roar of the flames. But Kane had apparently reached the same conclusion. Instead of continuing the gunfight, he made a desperate dash for a section of the wall that Jake hadn't noticed before. A hidden door that had been concealed behind a hanging tapestry. Kane disappeared through the opening just as a ceiling beam, weakened by the fire, crashed down where he had been standing. "There's a tunnel system," Brennan gasped, clutching his wounded leg. "Kane's had escape routes built throughout the compound. If he reaches the surface, he'll have 50 men hunting us within minutes." Jake helped Brennan to his feet while Claire gathered what information she could from the papers scattered around Kane's impromptu command post. Many of the documents were already catching fire, but she managed to salvage several that looked important. "Can you walk?" Jake asked Brennan. "I'll have to, but we need to get to the surface fast, and we need horses. The fire will spread to the main floor soon, and when it does, this whole place will go up like a powder keg." They made their way through the hidden door Kane had used, following a narrow tunnel that led upward through the rock foundation of the house. Behind them, the fire roared with increasing intensity, consuming everything in the basement room and sending smoke billowing through the tunnel. The passage emerged in a small shed behind the main house. giving them a view of the compound's central courtyard. Already, men were running toward the main building with buckets of water, trying to contain the fire that was beginning to show through the ground floor windows. In the confusion, no one immediately noticed three figures emerging from the shed. "The horses," Claire said, pointing toward the corrals where their mounts from the morning were still saddled and waiting. "If we can reach them." We'll have to fight our way out," Jake finished. "Kane's probably already organizing his men." As if summoned by his words, Vernon Kane appeared on the front porch of the burning house, his expensive suit torn and his face blackened with smoke. He spotted them immediately and began shouting orders to his men, pointing in their direction with furious gestures. "There! Stop them! Don't let them reach the horses!" Gunfire erupted across the compound as Kane's men responded to their leader's commands. Bullets whined through the air around Jake, Claire, and Brennan as they made a desperate dash for the corrals. Jake returned fire with his Colt, while Claire used the pistol she had taken from the guard. Brennan, despite his wounded leg, managed to keep pace with them while providing covering fire. They reached the horses just as a group of Kane's men rounded the corner of a nearby building. Jake vaulted into his saddle and spurred his horse toward the compound's main gate, while Claire and Brennan mounted their own animals with practiced speed. Behind them, the main house was now fully engulfed in flames, sending a pillar of black smoke into the autumn sky. The gate was partially blocked by men trying to organize a bucket brigade, but Jake's charging horse scattered them like 9 pins. Claire and Brennan followed close behind, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone courtyard as they galloped toward freedom. More gunfire erupted from behind them, and Jake felt a bullet tug at his jacket sleeve, but they were moving fast now, climbing the trail that led out of the hidden valley while Kane's men struggled to organize pursuit. The fire had thrown the entire compound into chaos, and it would take precious minutes for the Black Vultures to mount an effective chase. As they crested the ridge above the valley, Jake looked back to see the full extent of the destruction they had caused. The main house was completely engulfed, and the fire was spreading to nearby buildings. Men were running in all directions, some trying to fight the fire, others attempting to save valuable supplies from the burning structures. And there, standing in the center of the chaos like a figure from a nightmare, was Vernon Kane. Even at this distance, Jake could see the man's rage and frustration as he watched his carefully built empire literally go up in smoke. "It's not over," Brennan said, following Jake's gaze. "Kane still has men scattered throughout the territory. He'll regroup, and he'll come after us with everything he has." "Let him come," Claire replied, her voice hard with determination. "We have what we need to destroy him completely. The evidence, the witness testimony, the connections to corrupt officials, it's all documented now." As they rode toward the distant mountains, carrying with them the information that would finally bring justice to the frontier, Jake couldn't help but think about his sister Mary, alive and safe in Oregon under her new identity. The 3-year hunt that had consumed his life was finally over, but in its place, a new purpose had emerged, ensuring that Vernon Kane and his Black Vultures could never again destroy innocent lives. The autumn wind carried the smoke from Kane's burning compound across the Badlands, a dark stain against the clear blue sky that served as a symbol of the reckoning that was finally at hand. But for Jake Callahan and Claire Donovan, the real work was just beginning. They had evidence to deliver, testimony to give, and a promise to fulfill to all those who had suffered under Kane's reign of terror. As long as Vernon Kane drew breath, they would not be truly free. But they had struck the first decisive blow, and they would not stop until justice was finally served in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier.